everyone for having me, and thanks, Lucy, for the invitation and for coordinating. So I'll talk today about the cultural evolution of cooperative norms. So cooperation is a bit of an evolutionary puzzle because individuals who pay a cost but don't get individuals are paying a cost to get a benefit, and individuals who don't pay this cost and get the benefit are going to have an evolutionary advantage. Now, one of the major successes of evolutionary biology is that we do actually understand how such cooperative behavior can evolve. And the two main solutions, kin selection and repeated interactions, can explain a lot of the cooperation that we see in other animals. But human cooperation can't easily be explained with these mechanisms. And that's because humans cooperate in large groups with genetically unrelated individuals. And they also cooperate in transient interactions with unfamiliar individuals. So I am studying the evolution. I'm trying to get an understanding of how such cooperation evolved. And the particular context that I'm addressing this in is in warfare. So if cooperation is an evolutionary puzzle, then warfare is essentially one of the starkest renditions of this puzzle. Individuals are literally risking their life and their limb in warfare, and the benefits flow to a wider group of people. The benefits of victory go to a wider group of people. So, one question that you might have is, well, is this kind of spectacular type of cooperation that humans display the result of political centralization? So once you get the emergence of state societies, are people doing these things simply because they're being coerced to do this by much more powerful centralized institutions, such as chiefs and emperors and governments. So, in order to understand the scale and scope of human cooperation, when you don't have politically centralized institutions, I've been working with a population, a subsistence pastoral population up in Kenya called the Turkana. The Turkana number about 1 million people, and this area in pink up in the northwest corner of Kenya is the area occupied by the Turkana, and the red dot up there is the approximate area in which I conduct my fieldwork. As you may notice, it's very close to the border between the Turkana and other groups in Sudan and Uganda. So the Turkana are making a living by herding cattle, camel, sheep, goat, and they live in a semi-arid savanna environment in which they're limited by access to dry season water wells and to pastures for their livestock. And as a result, they live in temporary settlements in which they construct homesteads such as these. And they periodically pack up their belongings and they migrate to new pastures, new water sites for their livestock. The Turkana also engage in cattle raids against neighboring groups, and these are raids in which the Turkana are able to acquire territory, so basically key dry season grazing areas and water wells, and they acquire livestock that part of what they've lost in previous raids, but also additional livestock to deplete their herds that they lose from droughts and disease. So participation in these raids is individually costly. The costs are borne by individuals, and these costs are pretty immense. So this data is based on about 126 interviews I did with warriors and with members of the community to reconstruct the demographic structure and history of the population. And based on this, my estimate was that 40% of warriors in my sample had sustained bullet injuries. The average mortality on each raid is about 1%, and some raids are a lot more lethal. There's a tenfold, you can have a 10% to 20% mortality in some of the most lethal raids. And 50% of adult male mortality is from warfare. Now, this is both offensive and defensive warfare. So about half of this mortality is from raids that the Turkana have launched against other groups, and about half of the mortality is when the Turkana are being attacked by other groups, and then they have to fight to defend their life and livestock. And if you think about, if you include children in this calculation, 1 out of 5 of all male children who are born end up dying in warfare. And this is not true for the entire Turkana population, but the area that I work in, very close to the ethnic border between the Turkana and the other groups, is an area in which warfare is particularly intense and particularly frequent. And in this particular population, we can say, subpopulation, we can say that individuals are taking on pretty immense personal costs. And the benefits of these personal costs are flowing not just to them, but to a wider group of people. So how's cooperation maintained in this particular setting? And what I've found is that peer sanctioning, so this is social disapproval and indirect or direct sanctions that are meted out towards free riders by community members, by their peers, by regular Turkana citizens, play a very important role in creating incentives and motivating warriors to join these raids, and not just to join these raids, but once they join these raids, to contribute and take the types of risks that may not be in their own interest, but are in the interest of the collective. So for instance, these are results from a vignette experiment I did, in which I present subjects. These are members of the Turkana community with a hypothetical scenario in which a Turkana warrior goes on a raid with the others. And on the battlefield, he basically lags behind his fellow combatants. He doesn't fire his weapon, and when the firefight begins, he runs away. So essentially, he's displaying cowardice on the battlefield. And I elicited people's moral judgments towards this individual. And as you can see, a substantial number of people in the community think that this act was wrong. They're displeased by the warrior's actions. They are motivated to criticize the warrior. They think that the warrior should be punished. They say that they wouldn't want to stand next to this person in a raid. They wouldn't want to entrust their herds with this person. They won't lend an animal to this person. Now, if you're a pastoralist relying on your livestock for your livelihood, you will regularly lose animals to drought, disease, and raids. And one of the most critical ways in which people rebuild their herds is by going around and asking people to lend them an animal. And so if you're any less likely to be able to do this and get help from people at a time in which you need it, this can have pretty serious consequences. And people will say that they're less, they don't want their daughter to marry this person. Now, you might think that these sentiments are the result of just strategic partner choice decisions by people in which, you know, you don't want your daughter to marry a coward because a coward is not going to protect her. You don't want to entrust your animals with this person because he's not going to do a good job protecting your animals. But if you notice, here in blue, I have people's responses to a warrior who actually had similar impact as a coward on the raid. So this is a hypothetical scenario of an unskilled warrior, somebody who goes on a raid, makes an effort, but is simply not a competent warrior. And as a result, he doesn't do his part, and he's not able to do his part, and his team doesn't succeed. And what you see is that people don't have the same sentiments towards this warrior, even though he will be unable to protect your daughter in the case of an attack, even if he might not be the best person to entrust your animals with or stand next to in a raid. People don't have the same kinds of more kind of moral judgments, negative moral sentiments towards this individual. And that suggests that these kinds of moral punitive motivations, or these kinds of punitive motivations, are about free riding. That is basically individuals reducing their personal effort, reducing the personal risk that they're taking in combat in order to yet being able to partake in some of the benefits. So these moral punitive sentiments do lead to real sanctions. So in the Turkana situation, individuals who are deemed as having committed, as having deserted or displayed cowardice on the battlefield do get verbally sanctioned. So they are criticized, they're ridiculed, they might be strongly advised and admonished by their age mates. And in my data, in about half of these, the verbal sanctions additionally escalated to more serious forms of punishment. The corporal punishment is when a group of your age mates get together and they whip or beat the wrongdoer, and sometimes they also make the wrongdoer sacrifice an animal, a bull from his herd, in order to atone for his wrongdoing. So one of the questions, or one of the things that we can see from this data itself, is that not everybody who commits a wrongdoing gets punished, gets either verbal or corporal or monetary sanctions in the form of livestock fines meted against them. And there are many reasons for this, including discussions in the community about whether it really was a wrongdoing, whether it was the first time he did this crime. So there are a lot of factors that play a role in how harsh the sanctions will be. But one of the reasons why people sometimes give is illustrated in this quote that one of my participants gave about why somebody was not punished, even though he was a coward on the battlefield. So the subject says, he may be a friend that donates us a goat the next time we go on a raid, or we may marry their family. So what the subject is essentially saying is that by engaging in punishment, there is some cost. We are severing certain social ties. We're burning bridges with certain individuals, and who knows when we might really need their help. So what the subject is essentially identifying is what is called in the literature as the second order free rider problem. That is, individuals don't necessarily, it's not clear why individuals would contribute to punishing their peers when punishment comes at some cost, the cost of the time and the effort, but most conspicuously the cost of some of these social ties that you might lose. And that is one of the main outstanding questions in when we think about a norm-based account of human cooperation. So there is an emerging body of literature that spans behavioral economics, anthropology, psychology, that suggests that people do engage in third-party punishment. That is, they will sanction individuals who committed a wrongdoing, even if that wrongdoing hasn't directly impacted them. But it's not clear why they would do that when there is a cost to doing that. So in order to understand how this punitive, decentralized kind of punitive system functions and why people are motivated to then do engage in punishment, I've done a series of vignette experiments that I will briefly describe. So here is, I'll show you people's reactions again towards two warriors. So in one scenario, the warrior goes on a raid and observes that one of his comrades is being a laggard and not firing his weapons, running away. And when he comes back from the raid, he reports this to the other age mates and initiates the usual process of sanctioning that should be meted on the coward. And in another scenario, an individual goes on a raid, observes that one of his fellow combatants is being a coward, but does not report this to his age mates. And what you see is that people think that not punishing, not reporting this is a wrongdoing. They do feel displeased by with this person who didn't report, and they feel, some of the similar moral sentiments that they feel towards a first order free rider, a coward. And they do not feel these sentiments towards somebody who does initiate the appropriate sanctions towards cowardice. So what this suggests is that there are meta norms, there are culturally evolved meta norms in this particular society that motivate pro-social punishment, punishment that benefits the group. And this is not all there is. There are, it seems, a very complex slew of meta norms that govern punishment behavior. So in orange, you see people's reaction to another vignette scenario in which somebody punishes a coward, but punishes that person in excess, so too severely. And people have very negative feelings about such a punisher. And if somebody accuses someone wrongly and initiates punishment against an innocent person, that is considered one of the most serious wrongdoing. So in other words, the meta norms are that seem to have evolved to promote pro-social punishment and deter antisocial punishment. And not only that, there's here you see people's response towards the individual who's been punished. If that individual deserved those sanctions and then retaliated against his punishers, in blue you can see that that's considered, people socially disapprove of that. But if those sanctions were not deserved, then it's okay to have retaliated against such a punisher. So again, the norm here about what the person who's punished can do is something that's motivating pro-social punishment. And lastly, one of the key things that one of the most interesting meta norms I think about punishment was that the Turkana strongly have norms that strongly condemn it when a punisher acts alone. That's the bar that you see right here on the bottom. And so this is their reaction to somebody who went on a raid, observed another warrior displaying cowardice. And so the warrior deserved the sanction, and the person initiated these sanctions and initiated the correct amount of sanctions and did everything right, but acted on their own, didn't talk to the other age mates about it and get a consensus and kind of collectively engage in a collective form of sanctioning. And interestingly, people think that doing so is really wrong. So as soon as that happens, people say it's no longer moral punitive behavior. It's a grudge. It's a personal grudge, a personal fight between these two individuals. And additionally, they have negative sentiments towards punishers who are not from the preordained group of people who are supposed to punish. So in the Turkana, the age mates are the ones who are supposed to dispense punishment. And so if a senior age group member kind of oversteps and punishes somebody from the junior age group, that is condemned. That's not normative. So, but it's okay if the punisher is a third party, that is somebody who's completely unaffected by the violation. It's okay if the punisher benefits in the process of the punishment. So, for instance, when you get somebody to sacrifice an animal from their herd, they might benefit. But none of these things are considered wrong. But very interestingly, punishment is seen as moral and legitimate only when it's being dispensed by a collective. And that's very interesting because in the literature, it's suggested that collective punishment is a way to reduce the cost to the individual of dispensing punishment. But it seems here that it's less about reducing the cost to the punishers and more about making sure that there is consensus, there's discussion, there's room for people to actually say, oh, this person didn't do a wrongdoing, I saw things differently, and contribute their perspectives to make sure that the person who's being punished actually deserved those sanctions. So I'll conclude this this segment by saying that. So I started off with saying, why do people punish? We know that when people punish, that motivates cooperation. But why would people engage in third-party punishment when it's costly? And what I've shown you is that Turkana have culturally evolved norms to mitigate the second-order free rider problem and to promote pro-social punishment. I will note that there are no reports of actual punishment of second-order free riders, which is interesting given the moral sentiments towards these individuals. There are reports, unlike in the case of first-order punishment, where we do see actual punishment being dispensed towards first-order free riders. And I can talk about this more in the Q&A, why this might be. So the next part of the talk, I will focus on trying to understand or providing a possible explanation for how these kinds of norms evolve. So we know that once you have a norm, people are motivated to comply with the norm. But there's a whole range of possible norms that can evolve. So why do particular kinds of norms evolve, and why in particular do norms that support pro-social behavior and pro-social punishment, what are the processes by which these norms could have evolved? So to get at that, I'm going to change course a little bit and talk about or raise the question of what explains the scale of human cooperation, because being able to answer this question gives us some insight into what is the selective forces that are shaping the evolution of social norms that support cooperation. So in the case of the Turkana, we I've documented that raiding parties are large. So on average, the average raid has about 300 individuals, but as you can see, some of the largest raids can have up to 1,000 or more than 1,000 individuals. And all of this is happening in a politically decentralized society that doesn't have formal military institutions. And the cooperation that we see here cannot be explained by either kinship or reciprocity. So an individual warrior, for an individual warrior, only about 1% of the raiding party would be his close kin. And he often doesn't know, he would know some of the people on the raid, but there are many people that come from far away that he would be unfamiliar with. So we know here that the Turkana are able to organize cooperation at a very large scale, but how large is the scale and what are the limits and boundaries of the cooperation on the scale of cooperation? So to motivate this question a little further, I'll show you the results of another vignette study I did early on in my work here. So the population I work with, the subpopulation of Turkana I work with, are called the Quatela. And I presented the Quatela subjects with a vignette experiment in which in one vignette, the warriors, two Turkana warriors, go off into Toposa territory, that's the neighboring ethnic group in Sudan, and raid animals from them. And I compared their response to these warriors to their response to warriors Turkana warriors, Quatela warriors, who go to raid the Lukumong, which is a nearby territorial section of the Turkana. And what you can see is that people had starkly different responses to these two scenarios, to these warriors. The warriors who went to raid another territorial section, people thought that that's really wrong, and they had all the kinds of negative, moral, punitive sentiments towards these warriors. And I will note that the Quatela subjects in the vignette scenario were benefiting from both these situations in which the warriors are going, raiding animals successfully and bringing them back to the Quatela territory and sharing them with widely in the community. So yet, even though they benefit from both these raids, they don't endorse the raiding of another Turkana territorial section, but they had a lot of praise and positive sentiments towards the warriors who are going and raiding another ethnic group. So there's something here that illustrates that the Turkana, the Quatela, have moral sentiments that extend to include the Lukumong, but not the Toposa. And this determines who we are willing to cooperate with, whose welfare do we care about, whose well-being are we going to prioritize, and all of these fundamental aspects about cooperative behavior. So to try to understand what might explain the scale of human cooperation, one of the theories that I've been interested in examining is cultural group selection theory. So cultural group selection theory posits that between group cultural variation is going to be, let me step back. So essentially what cultural group selection theory is explaining is it's explaining the evolution of large-scale cooperative behavior by saying that such cooperative behavior evolved due to competition between groups that have distinct cultural traits and cultural institutions. And so that the groups that do have cooperative institutions that facilitate payoffs and benefits to the group as a whole are going to outcompete and grow. And so what we should see, so two of the predictions of cultural group selection theory, one is that you should have sufficient between group variation for this to occur. And in particular, cultural variation should be substantially higher than between group genetic variation, because we know that between group genetic variation is not sufficient to get cooperation, because if it were, you should see a ton of cooperation across the animal kingdom at very large scales, but we don't see that. And second, the theory predicts that the scale of cooperation should then coincide with the scale of cultural similarity. So people should be motivated to cooperate with individuals who share their cultural norms, beliefs, and values, and not cooperate with individuals who have different sets of values, beliefs, and norms. So to test the predictions of cultural group selection, we needed to calculate the statistic called cultural FST, which is the proportion of the total variation in cultural traits that lies at the group level. So it's between group variation, it's a ratio of between group variation in cultural traits over the total variation, which is the sum of between group variation and individual variation. So the higher this number is, the greater the scope for group level selection to act on cultural traits. So there's been some work on estimating cultural FSTs in various populations, but these studies have not linked the cultural FST values to the scale of cooperation as we wanted to do in our study. And to do that, we need to measure cooperation and cultural variation at multiple social scales. So that's what we tried to do. So to illustrate the logic here, here I have a picture of two hypothetical groups that have a nested social structure. So you have subgroups, let's say these are clans that are nested within an ethno-linguistic group. Now, if most of the cultural variation is between clans, then you're going to expect cultural group selection to act at the clan level, and it's going to favor the evolution of cooperative norms that benefit the clan, even if it comes at the expense of other clans. But if most of the cultural variation is at the between ethno-linguistic groups, then you're going to expect cultural group selection to be acting mostly at the ethno-linguistic scale, and it's going to favor the evolution of cooperative norms that facilitate cooperation across clans within an ethno-linguistic group and create benefits for the ethno-linguistic group at the expense of other ethno-linguistic groups. So our goal was to measure cultural differentiation between populations at multiple social scales and assess the social scale at which individuals cooperate and the extent of cooperation at each of these social scales, and map the cultural differentiation onto the levels of cooperation. So for this, I worked with Carla Handley, who was a postdoc with me at the time. And Carla is Carla had previously done over 13 years of work with 3 pastoral groups in northern Kenya: the Samburu, the Borana, and the Rendille. And so we were able to combine these 4 different sites and examine this, test these predictions. So for our study, we recruited 750 individuals from these 4 ethnic groups, and we sampled 9 different clans across these ethnic groups. So 2 clans in these groups and 3 clans in the Turkana. And in the Turkana, additionally, because they have a territory-based subdivision, we also included individuals from 3 different territorial sections. So here, to measure cultural variation, we identified 49 cultural traits. Those are norms or beliefs, and we asked subjects if they agree or disagree with these norms. that tells us whether they have that cultural trait or not, whether they adhere to that particular cultural norm or not. And to measure the scale of cooperation, we developed 16 culturally situated vignette scenarios of helping behaviors that we actually do see commonly occurring in these populations, or some of those forms of helping involved not harming, refraining from harming or taking from another person. And we varied who the target of this helping is, whether that individual is from the same clan as the actor, from a different clan as the actor, from a different ethnic group as the actor, and in the case of the Turkana, also whether the individual was from a different territorial section as the actor. And so here's what we found. So this is showing you the cultural FST values from our study are shown above this dark line here. And what you can, and down here, I have genetic FST estimates from the literature. These are not of the same populations that we studied, but of various, of other populations. And what you can see is that there is cultural differentiation is, there's a lot more cultural differentiation than genetic differentiation. And in particular, most of that cultural differentiation in our area, in our study populations, lie between ethnic groups. So you have about 8% to about 20% of the variation in cultural traits are lying between ethnic groups. So each of these bars is the pairwise FST between each pair of groups. And the FSTs between territorial sections and clans is much smaller. Okay, so here, most of the cultural variation occurs at the ethno-linguistic scale, and so we should expect cooperation. So first, we should expect that to determine who people cooperate with. And second, it's also telling us that there is scope for cultural group selection to operate and shape cooperative norms. I will skip over this in the interest of time, but essentially here I'll show you the results of in which we have included geographic distance between populations and the cultural FST between populations, and looked at to what extent these predictors can explain the endorsements for the cooperative act. So the higher the endorsement of the cooperative act, the stronger the indication that there's a norm that says you need to cooperate with individuals from this particular subgroup. And what I've shown you first is that geographic distance actually didn't have a strong effect. So it didn't matter that you were living very close or far away from this particular subpopulation. It wasn't a significant predictor of cooperation rates, but cultural FST was a strong and significant predictor of cooperation rates. So as you can see, as predicted, if cultural group selection were operating, the higher the FST values between groups, that is, the higher the cultural differentiation between groups, the lower the rate of endorsements for cooperative action. And so this essentially, to summarize the results of the study, first, the measurements of cultural variation that we do get between ethno-linguistic groups are higher than available genetic FST measurements. And the scales at which individuals cooperate are mapping on to the variation in cultural relatedness. So there is a correspondence, the kind of correspondence that you would expect. And so it suggests, or it certainly supports the fact, the notion that cultural group selection is influencing the evolution of cooperative norms. And if that's the case, going back to the earlier part of my talk, a process like cultural group selection can also help explain how you get all these complex meta norms that are promoting pro-social punishment, pro-social norm enforcement behaviors that are good for the good for the group. So I'll conclude the talk by saying that I hope with this combination of data on the on basically the cultural evolution of cooperative norms, I've given you some evidence to suggest that culture, the capacity for culture, has relieved a major constraint on the evolution of cooperation, and it has conferred humans with cooperative norms and moral sentiments, but there are limits to these, to our capacity for cooperation, in that because cooperation is a product of a process like cultural group selection, our cooperative tendencies are going to be culturally parochial. So with that, I will end thanking my the host communities, the various field assistants who have helped in these projects, and Carla Handley, who played a pivotal role and spearheaded the data collection for the Cultural FST project, and all the funding organizations who supported me. So I will stop the share.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a really great talk.
Thank you.
We'll go into the Q&A now. And we actually received some questions by email, so I guess we can start with them whilst people think of their questions. So how does a region's level of parasite load impact both between group cooperation and cultural variation?
I don't know the answer for this particular context, but I'm guessing that you're alluding to some of the literature from evolutionary psychology that says that that's one of the reasons why people are afraid of outgroup members and have negative stereotypes towards outgroup members. These are all populations that do not, they're subsistence societies that have very limited access to healthcare and to a lot of the infrastructure that governments are providing. So in general, in general, they're all living kind of at the margins of access to healthcare, and there are a lot of illnesses that are common across them. So, you know, the prevalence of malaria, etc., malaria, cholera, brucellosis, and I would not think that there are big differences in the parasite load between these groups. I just, you know, I'll be very surprised if that was helping to explain any of the variation that we're seeing.
So we have a question from the chat. Could you elaborate on why you think second order punishment is not being observed, please?
Yeah, thanks. So there are a couple different potential explanations. So one is that not punishing somebody is kind of a crime of omission than a crime of commission. And in general, there are much lower rates of actual punishment towards individuals who are committing, whose wrong is that they omitted to do something. And you see that also in the case of first order free riding. So people who go on raids and turn back, like deserters, or people who go on raids and don't fight well on the battlefield, are being sanctioned. But people who do not participate in raids are seldom actually sanctioned. And that's because on any particular instance, you might have a variety of reasons why you can't join a raid. You might have herding duties, you might have to look after your your siblings, etc. So in general, I expect to see lower implementation of punishment for these kinds of wrongdoings, just because it's very hard to get sufficient data to make the inference for people that, okay, this person actually is showing a pattern of rewriting behavior. The other reason could be that maybe all you need is some kind of feeling that people will socially disapprove of you. And that might translate into subtle indirect sanctions, like, they're less likely to want to go out of their way to help you, as they would for somebody who's kind of seen as a very important player in terms of enforcing the correct behavior within their age group, etc. So those are the two main reasons I can think of.
So another question from the chat. Presumably for cultural group selection to produce cultural norms of punishment, it would need to offer an advantage to groups that punish over those that don't. Have you been able to study this possibility?
So you were breaking up when you asked that question. So could you just repeat that?
Sorry. Presumably for cultural group selection to produce cultural norms of punishment, it will need to offer an advantage to groups that punish over those that don't. Have you been able to study this possibility?
Yeah, so in this particular case, we have we've looked at which set of norms, the variation in which set of norms has the strongest effect on explaining the scale of cooperation. And when I said that we did 49 norms, those 49 norms were divided so that about a fifth of those norms were about raiding and warfare type behavior, and some of those norms were about crime and punishment. And what we found actually was that the raiding related norms had the strongest effect on determining the scale of cooperation. So essentially what that meant is that the set of people who have shared norms about what the right thing to do on a raid is, and how you should organize for a raid, and how you should conduct yourself for a raid, and who should go on a raid, etc. That set of people were the ones who had the people were most likely to endorse cooperation and obligate cooperation within that scale. We didn't see a similar pronounced effect on punishment behavior per se. To skirt back to your question, in some sense, it's hard for us to a priori say which norms are going to have the biggest effect on a group's cultural success, because we don't have a very good mapping between, particular norms and group benefit. But I wouldn't have been surprised if the punishment norms emerged as one of the really important predictors. But I don't think that it's inconsistent. It could just be that the rating related norms in this particular context are determining a huge part of group level success. They explain expansion, they're explaining access to territory, success on these in warfare. And so that's basically kind of overwhelming the effect of some of the other norms that impact group success.
So another one from the chat, it's quite a long one, so hopefully I don't break up. Many thanks for your paper. Was the issue of duration of reputation raised in your work with the Turkana? How long does the reputation for cowardice last? Does it last beyond the next raid, or will better effort in a subsequent raid redeem the previous display of cowardice? I suppose in one sense, lack of skill, on the other hand, in battle is might not be redeemed so easily on future occasions, but the reputation for being unskilled could last in a more enduring way, regardless of punishment.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I was having this exact conversation with some of the undergrads who've been coding the Turkana data, many of whom are uh, have ties to the U.S. military, and they've said they noted actually that there was a very important difference in how the Turkana viewed cowardice. That they viewed cowardice as a very kind of temporary thing. It's a very limited in its scope. When you say somebody is a coward, you're basically talking about their action on a particular raid, or that's limited at least in the context of raiding. It's not kind of like, you're this horrible bad person, you're this kind of moral, you have no moral character kind of thing. And there is actually part of the punishment process is really about encouragement. People view it as a way to bring somebody into the fold, to teach them, to educate them, to advise them on what it is, what they need to do to be, seen as a good warrior. So it isn't considered an intrinsic character that can't be changed, except if people have tried for a long time with a particular warrior and they've just decided for certain individuals, this is just how they are. There's nothing we can do about it. Lack of skill, I think, is seen more as a intrinsic trait that can't be changed, just because none of the Turkana have do training prior to raids, and so they do feel like a lot of the skill variation, some of the skill variation at least, has to just do with, how steady of a hand you have and what your, general composure is during in this very high risk, high stakes situation.
So John Gowler has put in the chat, very enjoyable talk, even more so for those of us working in Kenya. Around Baringo, Ian Hodder found that material culture boundaries didn't coincide with ethno-linguistic boundaries. Do you think cultural norms tend to change with those boundaries?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Basically, what is the which set of cultural norms might have kind of the population structure of which set of cultural norms might be the best predictor for cooperation. And I think that my very general take on this is that I think the material culture will have less to do than with this than social institutions, and that's because material culture can easily basically flow between ethno-linguistic boundaries through trade, and that happens a lot. Like if you look at the material culture of the Turkana, Samburu, etc., their material culture is very similar, because an individual can actually the spread of rifles, the spread of firearms in the Turkana, that started with the Dodos and the Toposa actually getting access to firearms because of the war, the South Sudan war, because of the collapse of Idi Amin Dada's government in Uganda. And as soon as the Dodos had firearms, the firearms spread through all of the pastoral groups because people could just buy it. They could see that this is a better technology than spears, and they were buying it. But social institutions can't spread in that fashion as easily because they're frequency dependent. You can't just switch your way of doing things and what norms you adhere to, because there's going to be social consequences and you'll take a payoff hit for doing that. So I think the way that social institutions spread is going to be more closely tied to the social group within which you're going to start getting cooperative outcomes, because you need the process, a process like cultural group selection, to basically start favoring groups that have social institutions that are better able to mobilize cooperative action.
So Simon Columbus has put in the chat, great talk. I really appreciate that it fills in what punishment actually looks like in the field. My question, do you observe any differences, direct punishment, e.g. aggression against transgressors, and indirect punishment, i.e. withdrawing cooperation and negative gossip? In particular, could self-interest play a greater role in indirect than direct punishment?
Yeah, so I think there are some differences. It's interesting that the difference is not what I kind of expected going in. So I always kind of thought that the indirect sanctions would be seen as more subtle and less severe than the direct sanctions. But when you ask the Turkana, when I've asked them this question, they've actually said that the direct sanctions are a way of bringing somebody back into the fold. You're saying that you still care about them, that you want them to be part of your group, and it's really kind of like an education based it's a way to motivate and educate people, whereas they think that actually something like not lending an animal to someone, not those kinds of reactions are actually much more cruel, much more severe, and they at least want to start doing that only when they really think somebody is just kind of beyond um, um, hope. They have no hope to basically bring this person back into the fold. And it's possible that the indirect sanctions have more to do with strategic benefits. But if I go back to the vignette in which I compared the coward with the unskilled warrior, I would think that people should be just as motivated to ostracize, to not help an unskilled warrior and not hang out with him on a raid, but they don't express those types of sentiments towards an unskilled warrior, even if he's kind of seen as as equally useless. So I think there is more to it than the strategic benefits, and I think it has to do with these moral punitive judgments have more to do with kind of shared moral norms about what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, we have one final question. Do you have any data that might show whether groups which engage or have historically engaged in raids at a higher rate have also A, evolved more pro-social punishment norms, or B, have experienced more change in their punishment norms due to commensurate changes in selection pressures?
Yeah, so I don't have data that would speak to the temporal dimension of this, which is, I agree that that would be a excellent way to additionally document a process like cultural group selection if you actually had historical data with time depth on how norms are changing. In this particular context, I can make rough inferences that I think are kind of consistent with this, but I'm wary of reading too much into the temporal data because it's not very systematic. But the Turkana have been a very successful group. So basically 200 years ago, they were just kind of the small dot in Uganda. They belonged to the Karamojong cluster of groups. And they migrated into Kenya starting about 200 years ago. And basically all of that area that you saw on the map has been areas that they've acquired over about 200 years. And they are a group that actually does have very strong, compared to some of the other groups, their norms of punishment are fairly, I mean, you saw the results from my study. It looks like they do have very complex meta norms that are promoting pro-social punishment. And that could explain why they were so successful. A lot of that success was through military engagement with other pastoralists who lived in that area. But I don't know the answer to how good were the norms of the groups that they then that other groups that lived there, and whether we can assess whether their success was really due to those norms. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, that we do need to do more temporal work on temporal changes. And I'm thinking about ways to do that in the Turkana through long-term studies, but I don't have an answer yet.
Okay, so I guess we will leave it there. Thank you very much, Sarah, for a great talk and a great Q&A. And thank you everybody for coming along today, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you all. It was really fun.
Thank you. See you.